The transition from military service back to civilian life is a period of extreme vulnerability. During this structural separation phase, transitioning service members face a sharp spike in mental health conditions and a significantly elevated risk of suicide. VFW data reveals the scale of this challenge. 2/3 of surveyed troops show signs of a mental health condition requiring clinical follow-up as they exit. But contradictorily, of those exhibiting risks, more than half decline referrals to DoD transitional programs. While an institutional safety net exists, utilization frequently collapses at the exact moment of highest clinical need. This disconnect points to a structural tension, a mismatch between how government infrastructure is organized and the psychological state of the service members exiting it. To understand why this disconnect occurs, we have to look at the macro-level approach taken by government agencies tasked with veteran mental health outreach.
These programs rely heavily on a mechanism of passive outreach. Care is typically initiated through phone calls, effectively cold calling a separating service member. A cold calling model assumes a civilian baseline of behavior, where an individual is expected to recognize their own distress, answer the phone, and proactively self-advocate for medical help. But military service is governed by different cultural standards. Personnel are conditioned toward rigid stoicism and emotional restraint, where acknowledging psychological distress is discouraged as a risk to the mission. Passive programs fail because their design demands active, self-driven engagement from individuals who have spent years being trained to suppress that very distress. Isolate the condition itself. Combat stress is a natural physiological response to the extreme demands and dangers of an operational environment. It is distinct from clinical post-traumatic stress disorder.
While PTSD involves prolonged hyperarousal and flashbacks, combat stress begins as an adaptive, functional state of high alertness. However, this state is transient. It requires active physiological resource replenishment, periods of rest, and neurological recovery to prevent the stress from compounding into a permanent pathology. When recovery mechanisms are overwhelmed, the first measurable indicator is typically sleep dysfunction. By tracking the breakdown of sleep architecture, we can observe the internal mechanics of psychological deterioration long before it manifests as a clinical disorder. A study of military personnel in the African Journal of Social and Behavioral Sciences isolated the variables driving this dysfunction, explaining over 73% of the variance in sleep quality. Trauma exposure is the strongest predictor. Repeated exposure to life-threatening events activates the HPA axis, leading to cortisol-induced hyperarousal that physically blocks sleep onset. The second factor is expressive suppression, the active effort to inhibit outward emotional responses. In a highly disciplined military environment, this is often a survival strategy. It is required to maintain composure during high-stakes operations. But chronic emotional suppression creates persistent internal tension, which physicalizes as a sustained elevated heart rate and fragmented sleep continuity. The study also measured cognitive reappraisal, the strategy of reinterpreting a stressful event to change its impact, which is typically considered a healthy coping mechanism in civilian life. Military culture forces a heavy reliance on emotional suppression, which quietly consumes internal physiological resources while the service member remains on active duty. In the Nigerian study, cognitive reappraisal is also predictive of poor sleep quality. This contradicts standard psychological assumptions, which frame reappraisal as a stress-reducing tactic that helps individuals manage their environment. Under chronic trauma, continuously attempting to cognitively reinterpret horrific events requires massive, unsustainable mental effort. This endless cognitive processing creates profound systemic mental fatigue, leaving the brain unable to transition into restorative sleep states. Ultimately, both suppression and reappraisal leave the service member's cognitive reserves entirely depleted. By the time they reach the point of separation, their capacity for high-effort mental processing has been exhausted. This internal exhaustion collides with external governmental policy during the transition phase. A Government Accountability Office audit evaluated the efficacy of the DoD In Transition program and the VA's Solid Start program. The clinical reality of cognitive exhaustion means that a bureaucratic cold call is essentially bouncing off an unresponsive target. The GAO found that the in-transition program failed to connect with over 70. By shifting the burden of initiation from the institution, the system removes the requirement to navigate a bureaucracy while exhausted. External organizations, like the Veterans of Foreign Wars, act as the receiving end of these handovers. These agencies provide an immediate safety net, coordinating benefits and care without requiring the veteran to initiate the contact. Warm handovers substitute cold institutional procedures with proactive infrastructure, addressing the specific vulnerability of the transitioning veteran. We can also look at solutions designed to manage stress before the separation phase begins. The Marine Corps' Operational Stress Control and Readiness Program, or OSCR, embeds psychiatric expertise directly into small unit leadership. This model integrates stress mitigation tools into the daily routine of the unit, rather than keeping them in an external clinic. This transforms mental health from an external medical procedure into an internal operational standard. By creating a common language around combat stress, the program successfully bypasses the cultural stigma of emotional suppression. Maintaining these networks while on active duty reduces the clinical burden on post-separation safety nets as service members transition with their cognitive reserves intact. Aligning government policy with clinical psychological reality requires shifting from passive, medicalized outreach to culturally embedded direct connection frameworks.